Penny, we're all set, so you can start as soon as you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. I thought perhaps the best way to get started is to just start with some basic concepts, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but just to make sure we're on the same page. So dementia capable, which is a concept that's certainly being used more and more coming out of the national plan. It really focuses on educating a skilled workforce and providing them with the skills needed to provide quality care. A little different concept is dementia friendly, which is a concept that's focusing on the modification of the living environment so that we modify our communities so that they are safer, more supportive, more respectful of people living alone with dementia or people with dementia and their family members, and more inclusive with the overall goals of improving their quality of life and helping them to age in place as long as possible. A newer concept is the concept of dementia positive, which takes a look at it in a little different way. It's really focusing on the strengths of the individual with dementia, and strength finding and really believing that people with dementia can live well, can live meaningful lives, and be co-contributors. And I know, because I've spoken to some of you over the course of the last few months in some of the programs that you're developing, that many of you really do believe that, and that's one of the focuses as you're thinking about developing your programs. So as I was thinking today how I might be most helpful, I thought I would try to provide some insights into the person's perspective to assist you in program and policy development. So I'm really going to break it down into 3 areas: environmental, personal, and social, and then talk about some strategies for working effectively. I'm going to talk about common things that occurred across my research, as well as across research of many colleagues, as I've done some extensive literature research in the area. And I put up this words much variability as much as to remind me as to remind you, as though I'm going to talk about common themes across the research that looks at the person's perspective who's living alone with dementia. That old adage that we've heard so many times, if you've met one person with dementia, that's what you've met, is one person with dementia. So there's certainly much variability, though I'm going to talk about common themes. And also what I'm going to do is, because if I really believe, as I do, in the concept of dementia positive, to just hear the experiences from my words really would rather be foolhardy and rather hypocritical. So as I talk about some of the common themes, I've also included narrative or quotes from interviews that I've done with people who are living alone, as well as some of my colleagues, because these people can really say it and express their insights much more eloquently than I do. And my hope is, when I'm done with my end of the webinar, is that it's their words that you really remember, not necessarily mine. So when we talk about the environment, the first thing I want to talk about is the home. And of course, we all understand how important a home is to us and how it makes us feel comfortable and it's where we go to relax. But for somebody who's living alone with dementia, it's much more than just comfort. It becomes a safe haven. So let me give you an example from some of my research, and I assume many of you could also give me similar examples. So I was interviewing a gentleman, and he had a daughter. He lives alone, but he had a daughter in town who has a little daughter. So he has a granddaughter who's 4 years old, and every couple weeks, the daughter would drop the granddaughter off his house so they could play together, and he looked forward to that so much, because his little 4-year-old granddaughter would tell him, "Grandpa, you're my best friend." And as part of that routine, every couple weeks, they'd walk a couple blocks to the neighborhood grocery store, and he would buy her a candy bar or an ice cream cone, and they would do this every couple weeks. And then one of the times coming out of the grocery store, he just sort of froze. He just couldn't remember how to get home, what road to take. And his little granddaughter said, "Grandpa, what's the matter?" And he said, I'm just not sure how to get home." She said, "Oh, Grandpa, I know how to get home." So she took his hand and led him home. Now, I tell you that story because it's poignant, but I also tell you that story for you to understand what that meant to this gentleman who had to depend on his 4-year-old granddaughter to get him home. So that home for him really became a safe haven. He was less willing to go out, less willing to leave. The home became very much more a center of life and all his activity. He was less willing to let people in to visit him because the home was one of the places where he still had some control over this disease, of which we know people don't have much control over, and we could still feel dependent and independent. And for many people who are living alone, some of these people have been living alone only for a short time because maybe their spouse has died recently or partner has died recently. But for many of these people living alone, they've been living alone for a long time. So that living alone becomes part of their self-definition, and it's a sense of pride. So this home really takes on much more gargantuan proportions than we would necessarily think than we would without dementia. Whoops, sorry about that. The next one I want to look at in terms of the environment is looking at the community. We know that our culture is imbued with feelings of and issues of dementia stigma because we have the whole movement to make a dementia-friendly community. Now, some people with dementia, talking about variability, really do feel the stigma very strongly and very sensitive to that. And that's what the first quote should show you. The second quote is also showing you somebody who it hasn't been a problem with, who because of the diagnosis has helped him. So let me talk through this a little bit. So for the first quote from one of the people I interviewed was saying to me, when we talked about dementia stigma, they said that word, Alzheimer's, has a stigma. I hate that word. It has negative connotations and is associated with later stages and death. And another gentleman said, "I've not really shared this with my friends. I don't want to be a subject of pity. I don't like that. I'm just not ready to tell anyone." So certainly those issues of felt stigma can be heard very strongly from those quotes. But yet there's another perspective, and that's what this other quote says. Was this gentleman was talking to me was saying, "When I got the diagnosis, I thought I would tell everyone I know to take away that stigma. Some people might think I had too much to drink. They knew something was wrong. When I got the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, a great burden was lifted off my shoulders. I knew what was wrong." You're saying, "At least I know I'm not going crazy," which is often what I've heard people say, and I'm sure you have too. And he said people were willing to be accepting, concerned, and willing to help. So you see that variability in how people respond to the diagnosis and the stigma. Next, I want to focus on the person themselves. And one of the biggest issues for somebody living with dementia, and particularly living alone, that whole issue of dependency. Nobody wants to be dependent. Nobody wants to ask for help. You know, part of our Western culture, being independent means being an adult. And having to depend on others and be a burden, we hear over and over again, is so difficult. And here's one person talking who really says it rather eloquently. "I've always been an independent person. I never bothered anyone for help of any kind, and there were times I knew I was slipping. My daughter, I think she feels she's stuck with the responsibility of taking care of me. I don't want her to feel that way. I hate it." So that whole issue of dependency and independency and autonomy that Michael talked about before is really very prevalent. That decision, and Michael also brought it up, is participation in decision making. So much control is taken away from you by this disease. So having control over your own life and making your own decisions, being a participant in it is so important for all of us, particularly for somebody who's dealing with this particular disease. So here's another quote which captures that. I don't make decisions quickly. I want to be part of the decision making. I'm not so far gone that I don't have my wits about me, that I can't be part of that decision making. I mean, to care and be loving is one thing, but just to take over? Another thing that comes up as you deal with this disease, it impacts your self-confidence, your sense of self-competency, and you begin to question yourself, and you begin to sometimes not trust some of your decisions, as well as more and more sometimes not trust others, because you're afraid if you make a mistake and you miss something, what's going to happen? So there's a real fear that takes place. And here's a quote again that enhances and enriches that understanding. I don't want to do anything wrong. I don't want to make any big mistakes or anything. This person talking about one of her neighbors, made mistakes and they put her in the old people's home. So this fear of making mistakes and letting people in to see that they might make mistakes is something needs to be taken into consideration when we're designing programs and policies. Again, talking a little bit about self-identity. That self-identity is so important. And again, this disease affects it. And many people living alone, that living alone is part of who they are. That's they're proud of. So here's another quote that captures this. Sometimes people try to do too much for you and treat you like a moron. I live by myself. I can do things. I can take care of myself. I don't have to have everything done. I let people know I need help in this area, but leave me alone in this area. So, we know there are domains where people living alone with dementia are doing all right, and we know there are areas which they need help with. So our jobs as researchers and healthcare professionals and social service workers is to shore up those strengths and help them in those areas and provide the services where they also are struggling. We know dementia can affect one's insight into one's behavior and about what's going on, but not necessarily. So I've worked with many people over the years who know what's happening to them and others who don't. So again, this is this variability I want to point out. If somebody can acknowledge and accept, and that's certainly very hard, that they have this disease, that's often the first step in moving them towards some sort of, working together to some sort of care plan. Other people can't do it. Denial sometimes, is certainly an ego defense mechanism, and they can't give up that denial because they can't accept what's happening to them. So here's those two perspectives. The first one with the acknowledgement, someone I was talking to, I interviewed, I suspect my ailment is going to get worse. And when it does, I'll have to live differently. You need to understand there's a difference between remembering and understanding. And then on the other hand, this is another person that I interviewed and worked with who had an aide come in every morning to help her, but she couldn't accept that she had Alzheimer's, and she couldn't accept that there were memory problems. So that denial was pretty obvious. And here's her quote, I always pride myself on my memory. I don't think I have a terrible loss of memory. If you can't find something, you can't find it, just look a little harder. The next area always comes up in research, always comes up in conversations, and is in driving. If you have been driving for 60 years, having to give up that driving, which is synonymous with being an adult, it's synonymous with independence and freedom, is very difficult. But many people are aware of the issues, aware that it makes them become more socially isolated, aware of feeling closed in, but also aware that they may be hurt others or themselves if they don't give it up. So you see this struggle with them. This is just a quote from somebody who's talking about how she's feeling closeted in. You suddenly feel closeted in your little area, and you have no place to go. Also, what happens with the course of dementia is the loss of initiative and being extremely tired. I've had people I've interviewed talk about, you know what it's like, I'm sitting on this couch, I know I want to do something, but no thoughts are going through my mind, and I just don't have the initiative and or the energy to do something. Where we take multitasking for granted, people with dementia can't do that. Just to focus on one daily task is difficult enough, and this quote captures that. You can understand when people just get too tired after a while. It's not physical strength. It's the strength of thinking. Like, people don't realize how much I have to think to make a sandwich. Something as simple as a sandwich. When everyone makes it and goes on to be thinking about what they got to do at work or what else they have to do that day, I can't do that. Just the thinking of putting the sandwich together takes so much effort. And the next quote really talks about initiative. Anything which needs initiative is now out of bounds. I used to do it, and I loved it. I used to go in the morning and have a swim, but now I don't do it. So this feeling of tiredness and lost initiative is really something that we need to think about as we're developing programs and services. Feeling of confusion. We all know people with dementia have periods of confusion. Sometimes people are better in the morning than they are in the afternoon or evening. Or sometimes it's night when they wake up and they're not sure if it's morning or night. And there's assistive technology that can be used to help. But this is one of the quotes that picks that up. When I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm confused, I think, what am I doing, Lord? Am I going into the night, or I'm waking up in the morning? You can sort of capture the anxiety of this poor woman trying to figure out what time it is and what's happening. Now, Michael in his presentation talked about, and absolutely so, about risks and risk assessment and safety issues, and we as researchers and healthcare professionals and social service professionals is really what we focus on, and well, we should. Now, some people with living alone with dementia are really quite aware of it. They're aware that they're at risk for falls and fires and what's going to happen in an emergency, or they're afraid to let somebody in, or problems of financial exploitation, and others aren't. But here's an example of it, and then what the outcome may be as we try to enter their homes and provide services. So this woman is talking. I had a knock on my door. It was a man standing there, and he asked me questions to try to increase your income, he told me. I told him I was not the least bit interested, and closed the door. I don't care if the king comes or the queen comes, or whoever it may be. I will not open my door anymore. So that's really focusing on some of the personal ways people living alone with dementia are impacted. And now I want to talk a little bit about the social. And the first line on the screen really saying, living alone doesn't equal loneliness. Most of the studies on people living alone will say that anywhere from 50 to 60% of people with dementia living alone are lonely. But there's a good portion of people who aren't. There are many people who have lived alone for a very long time and are quite comfortable with it. And we also know that in a crowd you can be lonely, and unfortunately in a relationship you can be lonely. So living alone, though loneliness can be a problem, we can't always assume that it is for everybody. But when we're talking about loneliness, what we really are talking about is how someone evaluates the quality of their social engagement, not necessarily the quantity. And also when we look at social issues, we know with the progression of dementia, people become more socially withdrawn and social isolation occurs. So what's very important? And I know it's difficult when you're providing services and you don't have a huge amount of time, but the importance of that social contact, that regular face-to-face contact, if I can emphasize that, it's that face-to-face contact is very important. Telephone, yes, but it's that face-to-face that makes the difference, that you take the time to listen to them, that you take the time to listen to their concerns. So, some of the research has shown that though people living alone may have people coming in, helping them in the house, cleaning or providing meals, they're task-oriented. They're not taking the time to talk to the person, and that's what's so critical. Here's a quote from somebody saying, "I don't mind being alone, though I can get awfully lonesome. I just look around and wish somebody was there to talk to." And this is from another study. Now, just because somebody dies doesn't mean your relationship with that person has stopped. And this is a woman talking about a relationship still with her husband who had died a couple years ago. And she really was afraid to tell anybody about this, but she still found comfort in this relationship. So here's the quote. "I still miss him. I still talk to him, but only in the bedroom. I put the electric blanket on one, it's two parts, and I put his side on, and he's still got his pajamas under the pillow, but I don't tell anybody about it." So she still finds comfort in knowing that he's there by turning the electric blanket on, the warmth, and feeling his presence. When we look and talk about social issues, we also have to look at support networks. We can't necessarily assume that people who are living alone don't have support networks. Some do and some don't. But we need to spread out our examination of support networks, not only to relatives, but friends. Neighbors are very important. Shopkeepers are particularly important. People that the people who are living alone with dementia, who may see a couple times a week as they go to the grocery store, or they go down to get gas, or to the mail person who comes through. And particularly pets. We know with older adults that pets sometimes become like their children. And so that relationship with pets can really have a significant effect on lessening feelings of social isolation. This is a quote from a woman. She was the care partner for her sister. She explained, "I'm trying to find something that would interest her now. She's not interested much of anything at this point." That's that lack of initiative. And we're talking about a little depression, obviously, here, too. She said, "But we're both kind of pragmatic. We're both concerned about quality of life issues." And that's what support networks and friendships do. It really speaks to our quality of life issues. Friendship is important to everybody on some level, to some extent. Dementia or no dementia, living alone or not living alone. What also happens when you're living alone is a sense of boredom. Each day becomes somewhat the same, and there's a lack of having fun in your life anymore. And this is captured by this quote. "Yes, imagine how time passes. Whatever it is, like time passes, although it's quiet and lonely, but the silence, I never liked, No, I never liked when you hear something. I feel sometimes like I'm alone in the world." And again, this is talking again about the importance of friendships and support networks, where this woman is talking how important it was to her that her friends accepted her and that she still needs them. So it's a wonderful feeling or knowledge that they, or friends, really accept me. I still need them. And if it weren't for the grace of God, I don't know. And I don't think I would have the courage to. I'm just honestly talking about going on. And finally, against the concept of social withdrawal, um, I don't like going to places just to hear people talk anymore because I don't understand everything that's going on. So I don't, and I used to love it. So we continue talking at our same rather fast pace with people with dementia, and they're still processing a little bit more slowly. They're still on our first sentences, and we're paragraphs ahead of them. And so it becomes more and more difficult for them to join in our conversations, to join us. So it causes them more and more to stay at home and to venture out less. So those are some of the social issues in the few minutes I have left. I just want to talk about, based upon the research, what are some strategies that might work effectively. One, as we know, with dementia capable, we want to educate the workforce in the philosophy of the concept of dementia positive, which is really person-centered, relation-centered care. We want to build upon the remaining strengths of the person, because all of us have strengths and all of us has weaknesses, and our role is working with people with dementia, particularly those who are living alone, try to help them with the remaining strengths that they have. Again, the importance of that centrality of the relationship. That's what's going to make the difference. That's what's going to allow you into their home. Understand that decision-making has to be shared and negotiated. They have to have some control. They have to be co-constructors in their own lives and care plans. And of course, with the disease, we know that we're going to have to reevaluate those decisions together on a regular basis and be particularly respectful of the values and rights of dignity of the person, as Michael had mentioned already. We need, again, to evaluate support networks, see if there are there, who might be there who we haven't thought of. We need to take a stance when we work with them of gentle realism. I really do like this term. Now, we can't go in rather abruptly and say, okay, you're not doing well, we're going to move you out of your house, because obviously that isn't going to work. But on the other hand, we have to be realistic, too, that this may be areas where these people are struggling. So go in with a stance of gentle realism. And that means you need to take the time to listen to their concerns. You need to step rather cautiously and slowly into that relationship. You need to pick your words carefully, because we know with people with dementia, sometimes they may not remember who you are or what their relationship is with you, but what stays the longest is the emotions that they feel when they see you, when they can see you as a friend, or they can see you as a foe, or somewhere in between. So choice of words is very important. Again, offering choices. As adults, we all want to have choices that we can make. Acknowledging the emotional struggles that, no, you really can't really understand some of the difficult things that they're dealing with, but you're willing to take the time and listen. We develop many programs for older adults that use telephones. Be aware, the research shows us, as the disease progresses, that use of the telephone becomes more and more problematic. Less and less we're going to be able to rely on it, but there are appropriate uses of assistive technology. If the person with dementia is willing to accept it, they're assessing their level of capability with technology and using that to help support them to live alone as long as possible. So those are really the strategies. The rest are some of the resources that I have available for you to look at. And I want to thank you for the time, giving me the time, allowing me the time to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Penny, and thank you again, Michael, for your great presentations. At this time, we'll move to some questions. So you'll be able to enter those questions into the question and answer chat box that we have on the screen for you. In addition, you can see information, the email addresses for Michael Lepore and Penny Harris, myself, and Erin Long in the closing notes at the bottom of the screen if you have any follow-up that you want to do with any of us. So at this time, we do have a few questions that came in during the presentation, so I'll go right into those. So the first question said that the recent Alzheimer's Association report from 2015 states that only 45% of people with Alzheimer's disease and associated dementias were given a diagnosis. How does this impact I think this is the possible parameters? And Michael, this was during your presentation. Do you have any idea how this might impact the information that is collected for NHAP?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, but we certainly at the National Dementia Resource Center, we can look into that. We could review the sort of NHATS materials and see if we could determine that some. But I don't know at this time.
Okay, thank you. So I know the person who wrote that question, so I will send her a little message and let her know she can contact us about that. And then the next question was, what type of pre-assessments would a primary care physician administer in order to assess whether someone has dementia? We can talk about we can provide our screening toolkit that we've sent out in the past to folks. That might be useful. Any other information either of you want to provide about that?
No, I think that toolkit that you have used before is really very helpful.
Okay, great. Another question. Yeah.
Hi, this is Liz Gould. I would also add that it's something for any treating physician to consider, because it may be that a person will not be able to follow through with the recommended regimen. So it is helpful to do those assessments and to recognize when there is a dementia.
Thanks for adding that. So another question that's here is, do either of you have some strategies you can suggest to overcome people's fear of letting people into their home to help, to possibly convince them that those that are there to help them solve problems, not put them away to a nursing home or something similar? Penny, any strategies that you can think of?
Sure, and it definitely is a problem. I think sometimes it's most helpful, again, it's based on that, building that relationship. If you can have somebody, a neighbor, or somebody that person trusts, introduce the home health person, the home aide, and say, this person is coming to help you, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to them. If you can use some intermediary in that way, it's sometimes helpful to get your foot in the door, but also that you have to understand that it may take 1, 2, or 3 times, though I know that's very costly, before they're going to allow you into their door, for all the reasons that we talked about. But if you could find that intermediary, that person who they trust, maybe the neighbor, maybe the friend, who could do the introduction, that's sometimes a helpful way.
Great, thank you. And what about some helpful in-home supports that can be provided to people living alone with dementia?
Well, it really depends on the person's needs, right? So that's why that assessment out of the University of Iowa is so helpful. It's hard to say, does a person need help, with making their meals? Are they lonely or are they not lonely? Are we concerned about, are they concerned about fires or safety issues? There's certainly things we all know you can do to the stoves and for electricity to make it safer, for better lighting. So it really depends it's so individual. It really depends on the assessment and what the person tells you that they need, because that's where you have to start first. And then as you go in, then start talking with them about some of your concerns as you step into the house. But you first really have to start and listen to what they tell you they need. That's the entry into their lives.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if either of you would know this offhand or if you have a resource that this person can look into, but they asked what the percentage of those who have dementia also have clinical depression. Are there any resources you can think of that might have that information?
I know I've seen it, but I don't know if I can pull it off the top of my head.
Well, we can get back to the person if it's something that you might be able to find.
Sure.
Okay, great. Let's see, a few people have asked if you can talk a little bit about some of the assistive devices that are available to support those living independently with dementia.
Well, again, it really depends upon their needs. I had put together for Liz, and I'm sure for Liz Gould, that she could distribute it, that there's a number of organizations here in the United States and in the UK that list all sorts of assisted devices depending on what the person's needs are, and they have you, some of them have you go through a little assessment to see your level of comfort with technology. But for example, the quote from the woman that I used who mixes up day and night. Well, there's clocks out there that have different colors for day and different colors for night that would help. For somebody who has having problems with medicine, management, there's assistive devices that will, an alarm will go off at the certain time they're supposed to take the medicine, and just the right amount of the pills come out at that certain time. There's sensors that you can put into the house to make sure that the temperature doesn't get too hot, or for people who live in very cool regions, that the temperature doesn't drop very low, so you can regulate the temperature. There's assistive technology that's focused on reminding messages, to remind them that they have appointments coming up. So it really depends on what the person's needs are. There's a whole variety of different assistive technologies that can help in those areas to have people age in place as long as possible.
Great, thank you. Let's see. We have another question, someone asking if you can talk a little bit more about gentle realism. We'll try and get to this question and then one more, and then we will close it out and try to get to people individually about your questions. Penny, could you talk a little bit more about gentle realism?
Sure. Nobody likes somebody coming into their house and telling them what to do or pointing out the problems that they are. As I said, some people with dementia living alone are well aware that they're struggling, and some of them are not. So this concept of gentle realism is really asking the person, the healthcare provider or the person who's going in, to be sensitive to the person's perspective. But you also have to, assess the situation and deal with the risk. So you have to try to find a balance where you and the person can sit and talk together about what their concerns are and deal with them first, and what some of your concerns are. Talk about possible approaches on a piece of paper. If we did this, what are the pros and cons? What are the advantages and disadvantages? People with dementia in the moment can do this. Now, they may not remember long term, but they're able to focus in the present and to do it this gentle realism is really talking in a very respectful manner that you're here to work with the person to help them, remain living alone as long as possible. Now, too often, all of us are rushed in our daily lives, and we don't take the time to really listen to what the person wants. So that's sort of the concept of gentle realism.
Great. Thank you, Penny, so much. And for our last question, in just a second here, sorry about that. Can you talk a little bit about how long-distance support givers can find local support for their loved one with dementia? Are there any resources you know of, any ideas for people?
I'm sorry, could you repeat it again?
They're looking, a few people have asked about how to give people who are providing long-distance support, so caregivers who live elsewhere, how can they find local support for their loved ones with dementia?
Well, there's a case, there's national websites that do case management. With the White House Conference on Aging, they now have that national website, www.age.org, that has some, you can go down and take a look at some of the services. The National Council on Aging have some ways of services. So there are some websites out there. And in many locations, there are private people, social workers or nurses who've worked with older adults, geriatric case managers or care managers who will provide the services and will, monitor the older person living alone's needs and act as sort of an intermediary between long-distance caregiver and the person living alone.
Another potential source of information could be the local area agencies on aging that are near the person who's living alone, that the long-term caregiver may be able to contact for assistance as well or for guidance as well.
Great, thank you. Thanks to both of you for your very informative presentations. We have a lot of questions from folks that we got to, a few that we weren't able to get to, so we will try and respond to those people individually. And thanks everyone for your time and tuning in today. We appreciate you coming, and I think one more thank you to Penny Harris and Michael Lepore for your time and presentation. Thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon.